The archetype of the scientist as emotionally castrated is fundamental to one of the problems we have here.
The question is power, who has it and who doesn't.
How can we dissolve the hero archetype and the desire for that sort of reassurance and rescuing, and actually be willing to be wounded and at fault? And that's a very different sort of story that doesn't sell very well in our media.
So that you know where I'm coming from, and you can cross-map it to where you're coming from, and also, you can prepare the rotten fruit and rocks to chuck at me whilst I talk. So I think conventional government and conventional governance processes are broken. That's where I'm starting from. And so are our media. So that's also where I'm starting from. So the sort of things I'm going to be saying today are with that mindset, and obviously you will have your own opinions on those, but just so that you know. But as you can see from the bottom, I am a convinced and deliberate optimist, and I made a choice in that as well, because if you spend any time looking at the environment and environmental issues, and if you spend any time projecting what's being said about today and what might happen in the future, then there are places of real gloom there, potentially. And I choose not to inhabit those places because I don't think there's any point. Climate change is complicated, but actually so are our media, and they're getting increasingly so, in fact. Obviously with the internet, with the various different forms of using the internet, alongside the gradually dying conventional forms of journalism. So it is a complicated picture, but really the question is power, who has it and who doesn't. Specifically with regard to climate and the failures of representative government, I mean, I was in Kyoto and I was in Copenhagen. It was 12 years apart, and two different versions of the same thing were hanging over the process as a massive break on what might happen, and that was a US Senate veto. So Obama had it hanging over him, and Al Gore had it hanging over him in Kyoto. And so this notion that a handful of the 100 US senators, some of whom were in office by virtue of a few 100,000 votes, because some of the constituencies are quite small in the States. So a handful of individuals held power over the global negotiations on climate change. And that is democracy. Ha ha ha. I wouldn't maintain that it is democracy. It's this idea that the leading historical polluter on climate, the United States, allowed other major polluters either to hide behind the United States, so the European Union talked a great game in Kyoto and is talking a successively less great game, and Canada, Australia and others just hiding behind the big bad beast, which is the United States, which it is bad, but there are plenty of other people who've just sort of said, well, if they're not doing anything, we're not doing anything either. And it's no surprise, is it at all, that poorer countries with far less historical pollution are saying, well, nuts to you, we're not taking part either, which is Warsaw, which is where we are at the moment. So Reuters as an example of trends in the media and why they matter. When I was there, I tried to persuade my editors to do more joined up coverage, not so much on climate, but on things like the global justice movement. We were great at covering the governments. We do rich governments, we do poor governments, we do industrial organizations, employers. And when we do a few of the hippies, basically, protesters, let's talk to them, what are they up to? Yeah, we'll get a few colourful quotes in at the bottom. But we would never lead on the hippies, not in the trunk story. We would never say, the people of the world say, this process is stuffed and you need to throw out WTO negotiations. This body is not a valid representative of anything. We would go, the US, the European Union, Brazil, whatever, and we would have a very polite sort of exchange of who's right, who's wrong, but at the level of the global elite, at all those levels. I mean, governments are elite. Obviously, the richer ones more elite. So at Reuters, I tried to do that. No resources, had to do other stuff, and no particular appetite for editors for what they would call polemic or lack of objectivity, which doesn't obviously exist. We're all totally subjective. Since I left Reuters, it's got worse, and that's not because I left. It's because they have got worse. You can Google the name David Fogarty. He's an ex-colleague of mine, a friend, Fogarty. He was writing about climate, and a new editor came in, a guy called Paul Ingracia, Ingrassia, and the climate coverage went sort of cut in half in terms of coverage, and was significantly more sceptical, and inaccurately more sceptical as well. So one individual came in as the managing editor. He was what you'd call a petrol head. He used to work for the Wall Street Journal, writing about General Motors and great American icon cars and all that sort of stuff. Doesn't believe, because obviously there is a theology idea to climate change, or he certainly doesn't accept the science on climate change, and he has a massive influence on Reuters, and as a result he has a massive influence on the world, because Reuters is the conduit of wholesale news to dozens, even hundreds of media outlets all over the world, which don't have the budgets to send people everywhere. So it's massive, and it's really bad news. That's Reuters, which is significant. Newspaper trends, I don't need to talk to you another version of going from print to the internet. It's fairly catastrophic for conventional media. Possibly that's not a bad thing in the long term, but in the moment it's a bit of a mess. It's basically, as I'm sure you know, an advertising thing. Printed media used to get tons of advertising, so did television, and they're not anymore, because, my daughter certainly watches the internet rather than television, and I personally never buy a newspaper, I read it online, so that's the trend that we're talking about in a tiny way. So the implications of those trends, as I was saying at the beginning, there are unlikely to be sensible responses from either governments or the conventional media that describe them anytime soon. That's it. That's what I think. So that version of the cavalry are not coming. However, alternative non-conventional responses are our only hope of achieving appropriately impactful change to global emissions of climate pollutants, and preparing our societies for the predicted effects of climate change. So it's alternative, non-conventional responses. It may be that these force the conventional structures to change, but if they do, they will of themselves call those conventional structures into question to such an extent that they may collapse anyway. And maybe that's a good thing. I personally think actually that it probably would be, as long as obviously it's not bloody revolution we're talking about. So, in lieu of fiddling, what can we do? Somehow or other, we need to talk about politics. British people don't like talking about politics. We've all been party to too many conversations that have ended in sterile, Yabu sucks type interactions. So we need to talk about politics, and we also need to learn ways to talk about politics which are not alienating for others or for ourselves, or prone to sterility, which takes us back there. I live in a rural community in southwest France, and it's great. It's not paradise, don't get me wrong, but people understand quite a few of the points I've been making at the start of this speech long before I did. So you can start from the place of media, government, busts, what are we doing locally? Regular events include some of the subsequent ones. I do regular monthly film screenings, documentaries, not just on climate change, but on all political aspects. We bring food, we watch documentaries, we talk about them. That means we learn how to talk about politics, we learn how to disagree, we learn even how to have arguments, and we learn how to calm them down. And we also eat nice food as well. But you also get to know people in your community. You break down atomization, you break down alienation, and you create community, which is a real thing. So this one is in community. When I say reach out elsewhere to find partners, I think of a woman I met on a civil disobedience march in Copenhagen while I was trying out civil disobedience as a reporter. She said, she was from a veteran of Greenham Common. She said we have to keep channels open to the outside. We can't go into bunkers and think, okay, each one for themselves, let's just grow vegetables and not go over the back of the next hill. We need to keep our eyes open, our ears open, our communications open to elsewhere. That's also because we, collectively in the rich West, are largely responsible for this problem. My own one, do and teach citizen journalism. I use a mobile phone to do sort of video reports. I teach people how to do that, and obviously it's in French, so it's not so easy necessarily to cross-fertilize to the UK, but it's something that is actually not so difficult. Blogging, video journalism, and the rest. Open forums, I'm pretty much most of the way through this Arnold Mindell book, The Deep Democracy of Open Forums. This is a very interesting book, and it also talks about not being frightened about conflict. Conflict, if it can be well managed, is an enormously creative place to be, and I'm sure you guys know that as well. What else? So that's open forums. Evaluate personal consumption, which is obviously a minefield, and it's a place to serially beat yourself up and then feel smugly self-satisfied. You know, in my own life, so I came by train from southwest France up to the north of Scotland, but this year I've taken 8 planes. I flew to Morocco on holiday. Oh dear, oh dear. So it's very difficult, but we must try iteratively to cut our carbon output personally, and also to some way, without getting our noses punched, encourage those around us to do it as well. And the last one, and I'm not joking, meditate. Why? I do. It does help stave off personal despair in the face of apparent hopelessness, and let's face it, there's plenty of that in this subject. Certain forms of meditation are explicitly couched in terms of understanding one's own suffering, so as to be able to understand and to have compassion for the suffering of others, which means that, you know, you can think of your worst enemy in a subject like climate change and realize that they are human beings, and I think that's really important. Sort of with compassion, we get a sense of our own incredible good fortune. You know, we're here, we're safe, we will get fed today, we're not in danger of immediate physical violence, although I might be, who knows. And then this other idea of compassion is that it does allow us to get beyond blame, because blame doesn't help us. It doesn't help us do anything at all. Blame is a way of killing debate and killing possible cooperation and action and solutions. And the last thing is, I do say this to myself, so I'll permit myself to say it to you. It's the idea that we shouldn't be afraid. We need to remember we are all going to die anyway, so none of this is as dramatic as all that.
Public views about climate change have changed, as you're more than aware. The majority of people in this country around 2008, 2009 thought it was a really big issue. You're probably more than aware. I had a chat earlier about how that seemed like the high point for maybe this group in its history. People were interested in the issues. You had The Inconvenient Truth had just come out. Yeah, we saw legislation in this country being passed with cross-political consensus. The Climate Change Act, one of the world's leading national legislations, and things seem pretty positive, and I'm sure you probably all remember this, and we've been through this a few times. But then we see after Copenhagen, or Hopenhagen as it was called, quite a dip in people's perceptions of whether they want to take on climate change. So does that mean that we continue to try and batter our opponents, the other side, the skeptics, with more facts? Do we tell them that everything they know is wrong? Is that going to lead to victory? Is it a battle? Does it feel like a battle? Certainly Patrick was worried about being bonked on the nose by some. So it sort of does, to me anyway. It certainly did feel it's them against us. We've got all the facts, we've got all the science. They just don't want to listen to it. We've got to hit them over the head with more science, more understanding, and then eventually it will make sense and everyone will be happy and then we'll get what we want. Maybe, but maybe the last 10 years proves that's not the case. But in our view, we're not talking about policy here, we're not talking about what are the solutions. Climate change itself shouldn't be something that people on the centre-right feel isn't theirs to understand and hold and talk about. However, over the last 10, 30 years, there's a vacuum where a coherent, compelling conversation is happening. There isn't a narrative there that on the other side of the political divide seems to be happening. So, what we did was we had a conversation with politicians, business people and key messengers on the centre-right who believe in climate change, who care about climate change. We talked, we had a round table with them, had discussions, Adam Corner led on this, brought in understanding, other psychological understanding and the research, and we came up with 4 sort of basic narratives on what we thought might be a good conversation starter for the centre-right. So you've got 3 of them there. The most controversial one probably is the first one there, energy security. But that was talking about how do we talk about energy as a fair and prosperous future for us all. And we can see the resonance of energy at the moment with the whole Big Six debate and what all those conversations are going on. But actually framing it as something positive that brings us together and sustains our future is a way forward. Trying to bring environmentalism out of the stereotype of me. And try and say, well, then maybe there are other people who can champion it, who don't just ride bicycles and live on a boat. And maybe they've got a different way of viewing the solutions, but shouldn't they be part of a conversation at the beginning when we're saying climate change is important, before we get into that debate about what are the solutions? Actually, climate change is more than just giving up things. It's about creating a better life for ourselves, and that's better food, which has a lot of resonance, but also social cohesion, working together and creating this good life. And then localism, but basically saying that we care about our countryside and therefore we should take action on climate change. So instead of just going through this in depth and trying to explain it further, Adam and I have tried to shape this into a political speech, as if I was on the centre-right. So I'll give it a go. I'm not a great speechwriter, and I'm certainly not a great speaker on that side of the political side. But it's just an illustration. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind. Right. I've just won an election, maybe.
Yay!
I'm on the centre-right, maybe change your name. But if I said, we all care about our countryside. We all enjoy it. We all enjoy our natural heritage, the culture that the countryside that we've inherited. We want to create a future for our children and our grandchildren that brings this on board. We create this positive future. But in creating a positive future, we have a debate. We can go with old-fashioned, dirty, polluting, carbon-based energy, or we can take the challenge and move forward into a new future. That means we have to make difficult decisions. There are fossil fuels in the ground. We're going to have to decide not to do that. We're going to have to take really bold steps, as our country has done in the past. There are an awful lot of people, of scientists, technicians, engineers out there who can lead the way. These can create jobs in our communities, across the country, even in the desolate northeast, where no one exists. We can do this together, but it's going to take hard, tough choices. But we, as a strong country, can do this, and we can lead the way. Will you join me? Thank you. Great speech.
I was very struck 2 or 3 years ago by a report analysis of possible trajectories for climate change and sea level rise from the Institute of Engineers. Here's a bunch of people who have no, towards whom there is no emotional investment in the public discourse. You know, engineers, we sort of trust engineers, they build things that are meant to last. And they, amongst themselves, are saying, hang on a moment, we need to know the context in which we're going to be designing things. I mean, Swiss Re and Munich Re, the reinsurers, are beginning to get quite serious about this, and we trust insurers because they calculate risk on our behalf. You know, we all have insurance. So maybe there are, sort of, but maybe there are bodies like that, you know, who have no kind of emotional loading, who actually already are beginning to explore this, and they're beginning to say, you know, we need to, you know, scientists, please be a little bit more serious about, a little bit clearer about how we're going to design our buildings.
Whereas the climate change way of looking at the world is very nuanced. You will never find a scientist who will say it's definitely happening. You will always, and I think James Painter's book on this is quite illuminating, find scientists who start the conversation with, well, we can't pin the typhoon on climate change. They'll always start with the empirical facts, which is you cannot associate, or there are errors. But in people's understanding, if you listen to that on the radio as a normal non-scientist, you were like, well, at school I was taught gravity happens, and it happens, and now I'm hearing a scientist who's saying, well, it might or might not, and that's immediately turning off an awful lot of people. And so there's an element where the scientists aren't helping this discussion, whereas on the other side, the Lawsons of the world are very good at maximising that indecision in people's interpretation and reframing it back and saying, and they've just learned from what worked in the tobacco wars, where the science was definite, smoking causes cancer. They just sowed enough seeds in people's minds that for 40 years nothing happened. And they're just using the same tactics very effectively.
Media is what's mediating a lot of this discussion. We don't actually get to speak to many of the scientists straightforwardly. It's mediated by somebody else in the media. And if there is the beginning of being sceptical, not just about politicians, but about media, and a desire for other sources, I'd really like to hear more about citizen journalism. I mean, could we all offer a bit of citizen journalism from today? How would we do that?
We need to depower the media, and by that I mean become the media. I mean, there's the expression of "we the media." It's even the title of a book. It has been an elite activity, the media, and in fact, to an extent, conventional media still is an elite activity. You need to have wealth to go to university, wealth to go to journalism college as a sort of standard way in, and wealth to be able to afford to work for nothing as well. So conventional media are an elite group. The beauty of the potential of citizen journalism is that there are techniques that mean that it's very much within all of our competences, both to learn how to do it ourselves, either with audio and do radio, or do video, and I know how to use, and I even teach how to use a mobile phone with attendant microphones to do video reports, or just write a blog. So there's tons and tons of things that you can do at many different levels and in many different ways, but it's to take the communication function away from an elite group, which is our media today.
Those of you who get up early in the morning, like I do, at about 6 o'clock, and then listen to the radio as you slowly become conscious, will be listening to the business news. And one of the things they're always saying on the business news is something like, well, what are the numbers telling us this morning, Jim?
Yeah. So behind these figures is something psychological, but our culture is only to give validity to what is quantitatively framed. And so when we talk about changing the culture, we're talking about something much deeper than just trying to persuade companies or persuade generally. We're talking about something deeper here.
I've been sitting with the image of the Prime Minister of Australia, I think his name's Abbott, who was presented as this firefighting hero. And it seems to me that we often maybe would do better to think about the metaphors of society, the way things are looked at from that kind of affective and more abstract and more emotional aspect rather than the quantifying rational figures. It's probably more important to the people of Australia that their Prime Minister is presented in this heroic stance than anything else, and it's very satisfying, it's very reassuring. And yet we rarely talk about the metaphors, the icons, the the heroic stances, the dependencies that we might have on that kind of image.
And I think that one of the central difficulties in our culture is the hero archetype, and trying to dissolve that and come up with other sorts of narratives seems very significant cultural shift. Certainly it's one I've been working with in psychotherapists for 20 years, is how can we dissolve the hero archetype and the desire for that sort of reassurance and rescuing, and actually be willing to be wounded and at fault. And that's a very different sort of story that doesn't sell very well in our media.
Well, exactly. I'm not sure we can dissolve the hero archetype.
It already is dissolving. I think that's...
I have another image, a counter image for the heroic, and that is I read that the chief Philippines negotiator in Warsaw has actually is undertaking a fast until, and it's publicly announced, until proper action is taken on climate change. Now he's actually evoking the power of the moment and of the power of affect, and he's joining it with a political stance. Now, what the response will be there, but it's I think that's a powerful alternative image.
And he cried.
And
he cried.
He cried.
When they do cry, then you know that something is shifting, because it's change happens in the right brain. It happens at a feeling, at a limbic system level. And if we just stay in the left brain, just talking about things, nothing really ever will change. The facts, figures, external, and it's at that sort of felt experience level that that's when things change. And I think in the communication of what's coming, of the challenges we face, unless we engage people emotionally and personally, actually at a level of sort of subliminal survival, not by frightening them, but by engaging them emotionally in the passion of, my goodness me, this matters to me and to my grandchildren and my family, and it's personal. Until that happens, we will be going around in circles, and Lawson will sound much more engaging because he's passionate.
This was absolutely out there in an area of the psychotherapeutic community in the 1930s, when Reich wrote The Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he was connecting emotions and political behaviours in fascist Germany, Nazi Germany. And we have been astonishingly slow to grasp the importance of the emotional connection.
For emotional reasons.
For emotional reasons, of course. Yes, we've been so slow. 80 years. It's obviously of the utmost relevance now.
One quick comment and then we need to stop for lunch.
I want to pick up with Chris on deconstructing archetypes. The archetype of the scientist as emotionally castrated is fundamental to one of the problems we have here. And going back with Lawson and so on, Lawson's Institute put on a big conference prior to Warsaw and brought in not Abbott but his predecessor, John Howard, who said scientists are experts at doing science, but politicians are elected by the people to do policy, and we are experts at doing policy and should not be subservient to any other input, including knowledge, apparently. Now, a scientist is a human being, and the communication, as I experience again as a climate scientist, if I just stay with facts and figures, there is no emotional mobilization. But to be a whole person, to be there left brain and right brain, to be there as cognitive and emotional and physical and engaged in that responsibility, to walk the talk with a full integrity of Gestalt as a scientist, and to connect viscerally across that divide and refuse the archetype that says you must not deal with the emotion as a scientist.